Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are undertaking a serious expedition into one of the most intellectually rewarding, yet, let's be honest, notoriously complex landscapes in modern philosophy.
We're talking about Immanuel Kant's aesthetics, specifically the questions he raises in the Critique of Judgment.
And our mission, really, is to get to the bottom of what seems like a core philosophical contradiction. A real knot at the center of Kant's work on beauty. We're calling it the paradox of pleasure.
Exactly. I mean, think about it. If a pure aesthetic judgment, a judgment of beauty, has to be entirely selfless or disinterested.
Meaning you have no personal stake in the thing actually existing.
Right. No investment whatsoever. If that's the case, how on earth can it generate a duty?
That's the entire puzzle, isn't it?
Yeah.
If my delight in the sunset or a piece of music is completely free of self-interest, I don't want to buy the sunset, I don't need the music to survive, then why do I immediately feel justified in turning to you, the listener, and demanding?
Almost like it's a moral imperative.
Yes, demanding that you also find it beautiful.
We feel this profound conviction that our judgment ought to be universal, that everyone should agree. But where does that authority, that necessity, that as if it were a duty, where does that come from if the experience is fundamentally subjective and disinterested?
We are searching for, as the source material puts it, the dynamic of its evolution, trying to find the source of the massive value we place on pure taste.
It's a huge question.
Okay, let's unpack this. To even begin, we have to grapple with Kant's incredibly dense definition of taste. It really sets the stage for everything that follows.
It does. Section 40 gives us the definitive technical bedrock. And it's a mouthful. Kant states, taste is the faculty of forming an a priori estimate of the communicability of the feelings that, without the mediation of a concept, are connected with a given representation.
Whoa. Okay, let's not just skip past that. There is a lot of jargon there.
A lot.
Let's take that first piece. When Kant uses a phrase like a priori estimate, what is he signaling?
He is signaling necessity and universality. A priori means before experience. So we're judging the feeling not based on, actually going out and polling people.
Right, it's not an empirical survey.
No, it's based on a necessary structure of the mind that we have to assume all rational beings share. It's an estimation that our feeling ought to be shareable inherently and universally.
Now, the other crucial phrase, without the mediation of a concept.
Yeah.
This is what guarantees its disinterestedness, right?
Mhm.
We're not applying a rule.
Exactly.
We're not saying this is beautiful because it fulfills the concept of a perfect triangle or something like that.
Precisely. If we applied a concept, it would just become a cognitive judgment. The agreement would be grounded in objective truth, like a science problem. But here, the agreement is demanded solely because of the feeling that's connected to the representation.
And that feeling is fundamentally subjective.
Completely. So the judgment is pure only because it's not based on concepts or on any practical utility.
So the takeaway, which isn't easy but we have to grasp it, is this. Kant is saying that taste is all about the universal communicability of feeling.
Mm-hmm.
We have to assume that this potential for universal sharing itself is what imports the interest for us. Otherwise, that demand for agreement, that sense of duty, it's entirely baseless.
And that leads us directly into the initial logical difficulty of this whole endeavor.
You mean trying to justify disinterestedness?
By means of an interest. It's a circle.
So the initial difficulty, as you noted, is this conceptual circle. It feels like a contradiction in terms, like trying to lift yourself up by your bootstraps.
It creates an immediate kind of philosophical vertigo, doesn't it? How can the very thing that defines pure taste, its disinterestedness, be philosophically called into existence or justified because of some underlying interest?
It seems impossible. But
Yeah.
Kant proposes an initial, sort of tentative way to look at this faculty.
He does. He suggests that perhaps the exercise of this disinterested reflection is undertaken simply as a form of elevated play.
Play, in this context, definitely doesn't mean trivial. It means activity that's undertaken for its own sake, without an external determining purpose. It's the free and harmonious play of our cognitive faculties, imagination and understanding.
And if it is just play, you have to ask, why is the pleasure we get from it considered a higher pleasure? Why should we expect anyone else to agree, even playfully?
Good question.
Well, the source suggests the value comes from what this play allows us to do. It offers a vital opportunity for us to express our inmost selves. So the purpose of the play, ironically, is the meaning that arises from that free expression itself.
I like that. And this connects beautifully to the idea of the expectation of freedom. I mean, think about our social expectations.
Mm.
If someone is fleeing a burning building or, facing some imminent peril, we don't criticize them for failing to notice the aesthetically perfect symmetry of the fire escape.
Of course not. Their vital interests are overwhelmingly at stake. The empirical, the survivalist self is completely in charge.
Right. But when the environment is safe, when there's no personal vital interest involved, society imposes this profound, almost nonverbal expectation.
It does. We expect a person to, as the source puts it, lay aside his empirical self, his muddy vesture of decay, and adopt a stance that shows they were at least born to be free.
That's such a great phrase. I find that expectation both beautiful and maybe a little too optimistic. It's the belief that a person ought to be able to draw pleasure from their higher nature.
From their rational and moral capacity, not just from base inclinations.
Exactly. They should be able to make the body, that mechanism we share with all other creatures, the keyboard of the soul. It's a metaphor for transcendence.
And that metaphor is absolutely key to understanding why taste is considered so elevated. But if we accept this mere play idea, we hit another problem. The quasi-moral question.
Okay, so if this higher play is just a refined game with sophisticated rules,
Then when we demand universal agreement, that sense of duty, is that requirement also just a rule of the game?
and if it's just a game, then someone who doesn't agree, who refuses to appreciate the beautiful, is just what? A bad sport.
Right. They incur only mere playful censure. It's non-moral. But our reaction when someone dismisses beauty, say calling a great painting a waste of canvas, it feels stronger than that. It's more than just disappointment over a broken social rule.
It really does. You feel a kind of moral disappointment in their character, or at least in their capacity for elevated thought.
This is the challenge. If we feel elevated because our aesthetic experience points our imagination towards moral ideas, are we genuinely achieving a moral status? Or are we just, as the source says, like children playing church on the Sabbath, just indulging in a self-congratulatory delusion of virtue?
So the question is whether a quasi-moral value can even exist, or if we are forced to choose between mere convention on one side and genuine morality on the other.
And this forces us to step back and try to locate the true home of taste. If taste is pure, it has to be divorced from both practical scientific knowledge and direct moral action. We've already established it contributes nothing to the knowledge of the object.
Right.
And we also have to acknowledge that the possession of taste contributes nothing directly to the moral character of the subject.
You can have exquisite taste and still be a villain.
Absolutely. So taste, in this sense, is a graceful complement to both science and morality, but it can't be founded on either one.
So if the foundation isn't objective knowledge, and it's not practical moral law, where is the attachment? Where does it get its value? The source offers a really compelling suggestion:
Which is,
humanity itself.
this is such a central placement. Humanity, as it's defined here, is a combination of two essential properties. First, the universal feeling of sympathy.
The ability to feel with others.
Yes. And second, the ability to communicate universally one's inmost self. And these two features together, they constitute the befitting social spirit of mankind.
That's a beautiful synthesis of the cognitive and moral links. We can communicate what is tied to knowledge, that's the cognitive link, and our inmost self refers to our shared supersensible moral substrate. That's the moral link.
Therefore, beauty, which is defined by this communicability of feeling, acts as the mouthpiece of the supersensible substrate of humanity. It's speaking a universal language that only man, as a complete integrative being, can hear and appreciate.
And that gives taste its profound inherent value.
That's the idea.
That definitely establishes a very high bar for taste. But the question remains, if taste points toward this high supersensible ideal of humanity, can we explain the mechanism of interest through more concrete, less lofty means?
Well, Kant certainly considered it, and that brings us to the empirical interest. So the problem Kant faces is still this logical difficulty of connecting any interest to a judgment that must remain disinterested.
The trick a needle to thread.
It is. And he resolves it by introducing the concept of the supervening interest, which is distinctly different from a determining interest.
This is a crucial technical distinction that often trips people up. So, if an interest is determining,
The interest causes the judgment. I like it because I need it, or I like it because it's mine.
but if the interest is merely supervening, the judgment has to be made purely first, and only afterward can an interest enter into an indirect combination with it.
Correct. The pure judgment, the disinterested delight, must be posited first. But then an interest can attach to it, introducing a pleasure in the real existence of the object.
And this supervening interest can be one of two kinds.
Right. Either empirical, based on inclination, or intellectual, based on reason.
Okay, let's start with the empirical interest. Kant links this to the most fundamental human inclination we have, the natural impulse towards society, or sociability.
Since we are naturally inclined to be social beings, and taste is the faculty for estimating whatever enables us to communicate feeling, taste then becomes a critical tool for promoting this natural inclination.
The social value of taste is undeniable here. If I can communicate a feeling of delight universally, that act promotes the cohesion of the social unit. It builds bonds.
And this perspective allows Kant to move away from high philosophy for a moment and sketch out this really compelling history of art evolution as an empirical, almost anthropological phenomenon in human society.
He describes this evolution in three sequential stages. The first stage, the most primitive, focuses on simple charms.
This is basically aesthetic ornamentation used for attraction or signaling. It often involves strong colors, easy-to-obtain decorations.
We see this in the ethnographic examples cited in the source materials. The use of roucou, that red dye among the Caribs, for coloring oneself.
Or cinnabar among the Iroquois. Simple flowers, feathers, mussel shells, these are all charms. They offer a basic sensory delight, but their primary value is as a social signal. They communicate readiness, status, identity. They are inherently tied to empirical enjoyment.
Then the second stage represents an advancement. It's a move from simple charms to appreciating and creating beautiful forms.
This is where we start seeing rudimentary designs in functional objects. Think about the forms of primitive canoes, or beautifully carved weapons, or clothing that's shaped beyond just what's necessary to cover you.
These forms convey no necessary gratification of enjoyment. I mean, a plain boat floats just as well as a carved one, but they begin to signify something more refined socially. It shows a capacity for reflective judgment that goes beyond immediate utility.
And finally, stage 3, civilization's height. At this point, the core inclination has refined itself, and communication itself becomes the central business of a refined society.
This is a key move.
It is. In a highly civilized state, the aesthetic value of sensations shifts. The true value is placed almost entirely on the degree of their universal communicability. That's the core insight of this empirical sketch.
And this is where the magic happens, socially speaking. Even if the actual raw sensory pleasure you get from an object is insignificant, a minor delight, a fleeting sensation, the idea that this pleasure can be universally shared among all members of this refined society.
It indefinitely augments its value.
Exactly. We value it because it is the currency of social interactions, what allows us to connect.
A follower of evolutionary theory, the source notes, could just take this sketch and fill it out indefinitely, tracing the history of expression from our earliest hominid ancestors right up to the modern aesthetic critic. Kant's contributions here are huge, linking aesthetic expression directly to social evolution.
Okay, so if the empirical interest, our powerful natural inclination towards society, leads us to prize communicability, which leads us to demand universal agreement on taste, doesn't that solve the paradox?
It seems like it should.
It seems like a perfectly plausible psychological explanation for that sense of duty we feel.
It is plausible, but here is the dramatic philosophical turn. What's fascinating here is the sudden, definitive, and seemingly arbitrary rejection of this entire empirical line of argument.
Right. After dedicating all this time to this insightful sketch, Kant just says, what was the quote?
This interest, indirectly attached to the beautiful by virtue of our inclination toward society and consequently empirical, has, however, no importance for us here.
He just drops it. But why the sudden collapse? He spent so much time building up this anthropological case for social value. If the combination is indirect, why dismiss it so peremptorily?
It is dismissed on a technical point, and this is absolutely essential to understanding Kant's critical project. The empirical interest is rejected because of its inherent incapacity to succeed as a mere empirical interest.
Because it's contingent, not necessary.
Exactly. The ultimate quest of the critique of judgment is to find something that can bear on the judgment of taste, a priori, a necessary foundation, even if the interest combines with it indirectly. And a mere inclination towards society, which is itself contingent and empirical, simply cannot ground a judgment that demands necessity and universality.
So we encounter the technical jargon. It's a hysteron-proteron.
Right. Putting the cart before the horse.
Explain that.
Okay, so Kant wants to justify the universal value of taste. He can't do that by appealing to a mere inclination, like the desire to socialize, which is itself contingent. It reverses the necessary order of justification. We need to explain why we value the inclination to universal communicability in the first place, not just assume that inclination is enough to create the demand.
The argument is, if the only reason you want others to agree is because you like socializing, that doesn't explain why they are duty-bound to agree. They might just prefer a different social inclination.
Precisely. So if the objection is purely technical, that the empirical fails to ground the a priori, then Kant spent all that time detailing the empirical interest merely to show us what the connection looks like in the practical phenomenal world.
Before pivoting to the true transcendental source.
Yes, that failure clears the stage. If inclination fails, we have to look to reason. We need a grounds that is necessary, not contingent. And that brings us to the intellectual interest. The intellectual interest is the next attempt to find a secure, necessary foundation for beauty's universal demand. This interest springs from a property of the will whereby it is capable of being determined a priori by reason.
So, in plain terms, this is an interest that's rooted in our moral nature.
That's it. And this is where Kant makes a really sharp and very controversial restriction. He claims the intellectual interest only attaches to the beauty of nature.
And is the only interest that always indicates the germ of a good moral disposition.
This is a major philosophical move. It means that the intellectual interest excludes works of art.
Why? What's his reasoning there?
Well, Kant argues that the interest one takes in art can always be traced back to motives of vanity or other empirical inclinations, like the desire to collect rare pieces, or being a virtuoso in taste simply to show off your social status.
So if I buy a beautiful painting and hang it on my wall, my pleasure is tainted by the fact that I possess it, and I might be admired for possessing it. This vanity, this empirical self-interest, pollutes the potential for a pure intellectual interest.
That's Kant's fear. But this exclusion of art, as you can imagine, immediately provoked a lot of controversy. We have to look at the historical critiques, starting with someone like Sir Philip Sidney, who championed human creativity.
Sidney, in his Apology for Poetry, he celebrated man as the heavenly maker of that maker. He argued that human artists bring forth things that surpass what nature can do. They create a second nature.
So the argument is, if nature is beautiful, surely the art that improves upon nature is even more worthy of our intellectual regard.
It makes sense. And Professor Caird pushed this critique even further.
Caird argued that if fine art is the product of reason, working as nature in man, then reason should be equally, if not more, interested in seeing a sensuous expression of itself in the natural world that has been remolded by the spirit, which is precisely what art does, than in just mere nature.
So Caird views art as a higher nature.
He does.
And that critique seems devastating. It suggests Kant is holding apart the realms of nature and human freedom unnecessarily. Why wouldn't the contemplation of human freedom expressed in art generate the highest intellectual interest?
This is where Kant's defense, as understood by the source material, is actually quite nuanced. Kant is not interested in mere nature.
What do you mean?
The intellectual interest attaches to the natural object when it is regarded after the analogy of art.
Wait, so the interest only exists when nature looks like art. The spirit of art is already present.
Exactly. The interest is not in the object as a brute mechanism. It's in the object revealing a technique of nature, showing itself as a system ordered by laws that we can't fully grasp through mere scientific intellect. It becomes the mouthpiece of spirit.
So the interest is fundamentally in the natural world remolded by, or at least speaking the language of, spirit, the very idea Caird was arguing for.
Yes. The difference, then, isn't nature versus art in the abstract. It's the inherent difference between a universally accessible natural phenomenon, like a sunset, and a potentially exclusive collectible work of human creation.
So it's the purity of intention.
Right. The lack of an empirical creator's vanity is what allows nature to serve as the exclusive indicator of a moral germ in the subject. The intellectual interest, therefore, rests on this profound contrast between spontaneous natural conformity and deliberate human vanity.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Even after establishing that the intellectual interest only attaches to beautiful nature, Kant's ultimate explanation of its ground, the reason why reason is interested, remains remarkably vague.
It's elusive, to say the least. Kant says reason is interested in ideas that have objective reality, and so it's of interest that nature should show a trace or give a hint of a uniform accordance with our wholly disinterested delight.
And he says this interest is merely akin to the moral. But the specific idea for which objective reality is sought is never explicitly named.
It's not, and that vagueness, that search for some ground or other, has forced later philosophers into providing these speculative analogies to try and pin down the meaning.
Let's look at a few of them. There are three powerful philosophical attempts to define that ground.
First, you have the romantic idealists, and Wordsworth is the perfect example. Wordsworth spoke of the exquisite fitting of the individual mind to the external world.
Which suggest a harmony established by a benevolent designer.
Exactly, a wise disposition on the part of the author of things. The value here is essentially confirmation. The real existence of beautiful objects in nature confirms our belief in a realism of natural finality. Nature is designed to make us feel this way, which affirms the inherent coherence between the physical world and our moral spirit.
But this ground gets ruled out by Kantian criticism later on. Why?
Because appealing to the author of things is the theological move. It relies on external teleology, which Kant wanted to avoid in the critical sphere. It grounds the a priori in a faith-based concept, and that just doesn't serve the necessary universal justification he's looking for.
Okay, so that one's out. The second analogy comes from Mr. Balfour.
Balfour argued for a belief that somewhere and for some being, there shines an unchanging splendor of beauty, and that we on earth only see passing gleams and stray reflections.
So it's kind of Platonic argument.
Essentially, yes. Balfour affirmed the supersensible reference of beauty, arguing that our subjective experience is simply proof of an objective, eternal, aesthetic truth residing in some ultimate reality. This mirrors Kant's some ground or other, but gives it a much more poetic interpretation.
And the critique here is that Balfour provides no secure foundation. He's just as elusive as Kant, maybe only giving a more beautiful expression to the idea that beauty involves an a priori reference to the supersensible, but without providing a critical justification for the intellectual interest.
Right. It's an affirmation, not an explanation.
And the third analogy.
Our third analogy comes from the micro to macrocosmic approach, often associated with Tennyson's flower in the crannied wall.
The idea that if you could fully understand the beautiful object, its essence, root and all, you'd understand what God and man is.
This views the beautiful object as a complete microcosm that reflects the macrocosm. It gives the viewer an obscure vision corresponding to the idea of absolute totality. So the intellectual interest is in the fact that this single contingent object gives us a hint of the unified absolute whole.
But this approach presupposes intellectual intuition.
Which is the ability to grasp absolute truth directly through contemplation. And Kant emphatically rejects intellectual intuition in his critical philosophy. For him, our knowledge is always mediated by our sensibility and our understanding, so this deeply holistic approach, while spiritually profound, also fails the critical test.
So the grand cosmological and holistic analogies all fail. Let's turn to the more empirical observation about harmony that was raised in the source, the concrete examples of color harmony in nature.
This is a fascinating empirical attempt to locate that trace or hint. Think about natural order. The observation that 20 different geranium leaves, each of a slightly different green, harmonize perfectly only with their own specific flower color, but they'll clash if you swap them.
Or the wonderful color harmony found in the feathers of hummingbirds, perfectly coordinated by nature.
The observation is that nature will not go wrong in its color schemes. So we, as the judging subjects, perceive a law of mere nature that ensures these objects meet our disinterested approval.
And since this beautiful accordance is deemed contingent, nature didn't have to align with our subjective requirements, the discovery of this uniformity leads to a unique pleasure connected with interest. We have found the trace or hint.
But the source rightly deems this explanation palpably unsatisfactory because it explains the diffusion of beauty, why we expect to find beauty fairly regularly throughout nature, but it fails to explain the supervening intellectual interest in the existence of those beautiful objects. Why should the existence of those geraniums matter intellectually unless we already had the moral germ?
It's just a generalized aesthetic finality.
Yeah.
It doesn't explain the necessary link to the moral will.
Exactly. And this critique forces us to abandon the external object entirely and focus back on the subject. The intellectual interest has to look for what is realized in us.
So the consensus shifts. A true Kantian interest must look to the working unanimity of sentiment in mankind, a partial realization of the idea of a common sense in ourselves.
Right. If the beauty of nature shows a hint of harmonizing nature and freedom in us, if it signifies the deeper moral significance of humanity, then the intellectual interest is justified because it concerns our own moral vocation.
That emphasis on internal realization suggests that nature acts as a kind of language, but one that requires us to project meaning onto it.
That's a great way to put it. We interpret the singing of a bird not just as sound, but as an expression of joyousness and contentment with existence, even though we know the bird has no such intention.
This is the crucial leap. We objectify our representation so that the beauty is regarded as if it were a predicate belonging to the object. Nature speaks to us in a language that carries the semblance of a higher meaning, which is precisely why the interest derived from it is intellectual.
To clarify this intellectual ground, Kant then offers two provisional explanations, which the source notes really represent a divergence. It's not a single unified thesis.
What's the first one?
The first ground focuses purely on form, the analogy to the moral judgment. The pure judgment of taste gives disinterested delight and demands universal agreement a priori. That's the aesthetic necessity. This pure form stands in analogy to the moral judgment, which also demands universal agreement, but it does so through rational concepts. That's moral necessity.
So the shape of the judgment is the same.
The shape is the same. And because they share the same necessary form, even if the content is different, the aesthetic judgment conduces to a, immediate interest in the beautiful objects of nature. It's a formal resemblance that we instinctively treat as a kind of kinship.
It's like a family resemblance.
Exactly. The delight in the natural object is interpreted as a mere play of the moral faculty, which implies a disposition akin to the moral. It makes a contemplation of nature a kind of moral exercise, albeit one without any real moral consequence.
Okay, so that's the first explanation. What's the second?
The second ground is arguably the more serious one, and it focuses on content, the admiration of natural art.
Here we admire nature because it displays herself as art, not by chance, but according to a law-conforming arrangement, and it displays finality apart from an end.
Because nature displays this incredible design without a known external human purpose, we naturally look for the ultimate purpose within ourselves, in that which constitutes the ultimate purpose of our existence, which is our moral being.
But this explanation leans really heavily into teleology, the study of purpose and design.
It does. And the source points out that this reliance on teleology is problematic. Kant explicitly relegated this deep discussion of ultimate purpose to the later, more speculative parts of the critique. He treats teleology as a regulative principle, meaning it guides our research, but it doesn't necessarily prove objective truth.
It's a way of looking at things, not a statement of fact.
Precisely. And the real challenge is that these two provisional explanations, the form analogy one and the content natural art one, they lack a strong inner connection. The form explanation deals with the individual's inner state and its resemblance to morality,
while the content explanation connects the interest to a supposed ultimate purpose in the physical world itself.
And most critically, both of these explanations entirely sidestep the essential social character of taste that he started with.
Universal communicability of feeling.
It's gone. The form focuses too much on the individual subject's internal resemblance to moral feeling, and the content focuses too much on the external world's design.
So, if Kant had successfully integrated the social element communicability with the moral element derived from reason, the foundation would be so much clearer.
It would. But as it stands, these are two diverging paths toward a shared, vague conclusion, and they leave the core paradox unresolved in terms of grounding that required duty.
It seems like we've gone through the empirical and the intellectual interests, found them both inadequate to ground the universality of taste, yet they seem so necessary to explore. So why did Kant bother, and why do they ultimately fail the main mission?
Well, the primary mission, let's remember, was to explain how the feeling in the judgment of taste comes to be exacted from everyone as a sort of duty.
Right, the central question.
And despite all this deep philosophical maneuvering, the intellectual interest utterly fails to achieve this universal foundation.
Okay, let's nail down the specific failure points. Failure point 1 is scope. The intellectual interest only applies to the beauty of nature.
Because that's the only realm Kant deemed free of vanity.
Precisely. But the duty to agree, that necessary demand for universal assent, applies just as much to works of art as it does to objects of nature. If your philosophical explanation only covers half the field, it cannot serve as the universal foundation for the demanded duty. Kant's system is just too restrictive here.
That's a huge problem.
And failure point 2 involves the nature of the requirement itself. Kant suggests that those who have no feeling for beautiful nature are coarse and low. We require others to take this intellectual interest.
This is a deep, deep problem. This kind of moral judgment regarding others as coarse for their lack of feeling is the exact kind of judgment we make regarding the sublime.
And the sublime explicitly presupposes a pre-existing moral feeling in the subject.
Exactly. You can't explain the universal duty of taste by resorting to a requirement that already assumes a deeper moral grounding. It creates a kind of absurdity. The duty demanded in taste is made as a matter of course, immediately, and without requiring the prior existence of profound moral reflection.
The basic expectation.
It is. Therefore, attempting to explain the common, immediate duty in taste by resorting to the necessary moral presupposition found in the sublime is philosophically circular and, as the source says, absurd. The intellectual interest becomes something we demand rather than the explanation for the demand itself.
So even though the intellectual interest fails the core mission, you argue its consideration is vital. It materially advances the argument in several important ways.
Yes, the failure is incredibly instructive. First, it completely rebuts the presumption that feeling for the beautiful is somehow incompatible with moral feeling. Even if art virtuosi might be vain and worthless, the affinity between nature's beauty and moral inclination is firmly established.
Second, it shows definitively that the interest arises upon reflection on the analogy the judgment of taste bears to the moral judgment. This analogy, the shared necessary form, is the real philosophical contribution here. It invites deeper investigation into the structure of the judgment rather than just its content.
And third, it brings the beauty of nature into line with both the sublime and art by recognizing Geist's spirit in nature. Taste only requires the finality of the object for the mind, but the intellectual interest requires us to recognize spirit in nature. It compels us to reflect on the finality of the mind in respect of objects.
This brings us back to that distinction between art and nature, which the source suggests Kant's critics often misunderstand.
They do. The real contrast Kant is concerned with is not between art and nature in the abstract. It's between the intellectual interest in the beauty of nature, which is universally accessible to all, and the interest in the real existence of particular works of art.
Those exclusive, collectible items that tempt vanity and possession.
Exactly. If we were talking about art that is universally possessed, like the epic poems of Homer or the dramas of Shakespeare, the lines would blur considerably.
But when seeking a heritage that is more universal than even our greatest cultural artifacts, we always return to the beauty of nature, which speaks to us in the mother tongue of the race.
And so the necessity of investigating how beauty is produced through symbolism, through concrete art, is established here. We've learned that the pure judgment requires an interpretation, the interpretation of the natural world as if it were designed by art. The investigation of interest has served as an instructive commentary on the inner meaning of beauty, and it paves the way for Kant's final, complex, critical account.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have seen how Kant tried to find a stable foundation for the universal demand of taste. The empirical path failed because it was contingent. It lacked a priori necessity.
And the intellectual path failed because it was too narrow, applying only to nature, and the moral requirement it established was too high to explain the basic duty we expect from everyone regarding simple beauty.
So Kant's lasting achievement here is not finding an easy answer.
Not at all. It's in systematically dissecting why subjective pleasure and objective duty are so incredibly difficult to reconcile. He has shown us that the value we place on beauty is inherently tied to our recognition of our own moral potential.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought, something for you to mull over as you encounter beauty next. If we learn that nature is only beautiful when it looks like art, when it exhibits the structure of human design, what is this universal art that we read into nature? Is nature in the end merely a keyboard on which human art plays the music of the soul?